Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being here. We're very excited to be at Hack in the Box. Before we head to lunch, we want to open up your appetite with some interesting topics around hosting providers' ecosystem, with a particular interest in the Netherlands. So I'm Mahjoub. I've been doing security for the past 15 years. My focus is network security, and I have a PhD in graph theory. And I run like the research and engineering team at Cisco Umbrella, formerly OpenDNS. And our team is basically focused on building large-scale threat detection systems and threat intelligence platforms.
And I'm Sarah Brown. I am on the cybersecurity team at NATO, but I'm working on this project with Dia for a year now, independent to that work. And prior to working at NATO, I worked for a few years at Fox IT and then MITRE.
So the question here is that we were discussing, Sarah and I, for the past couple of years about hosting providers, bulletproof hosting, and I've been doing this work for years now. But then Sarah has some solid background in threat intel, and she worked at some companies doing that type of thing. Plus, she lives in the Netherlands, so I was like, okay, how about we combine our efforts and motivations and come up with a study around the Dutch space and how it's being abused or maybe used for some unintended goals, and hence the presentation of today. So when we look at the threat landscape from a hosting perspective, or at least from an IP space perspective, we'll see two main classes. Most of us in the industry will focus on hosted content. We'll use like passive DNS, we'll look into all kinds of bad stuff, for example, malware C2s, ransomware, phishing, site selling stolen credentials, cybercrime forums, etc. And all of those are using IP space to host the content itself. However, there's another class of usage of IP space, which is when these servers are weaponized to send, let's say, spam, to conduct DDoS attacks, or they can be, you can install on them once you get them some software to massively do like brute force attacks against WordPress and SSH. So in this study, we try to combine these two views to come up with I would say, an assessment of how things are being used in this IP space. In fact, when you look at you look into the hosting providers ecosystem, you'll see that you'll have your legit ones. These are companies who have a clean business model. They try to provide space for people and organizations to host their good content, to support their businesses and kind of all kinds of good things. But then these companies, they tend to be abused very often because either they don't have clear terms of service or they don't have enough staff to clean up their space. And then you have the pure criminal ones who stand on the extreme right of the spectrum, and these are like the pure criminal ones, which we call bulletproof hosting. And in this presentation, we're going to kind of navigate around the abused and bulletproof ones and see how are they actually succeeding in doing this type of work, like operations.
Okay, so we're conducting a threat intel investigation, and for that we can follow the standard threat intel cycle, which gives us a good structure for our work. So while we're collecting IOCs and processing this data and enriching the data, we can follow this cycle as we build the context and understand how these businesses are operating. So with this cycle, we start with requirements. What are the high-level objectives? What kind of information are we trying to collect, and who are we trying to collect it for? Who are the stakeholders in the project? And then for the collection, we're collecting information through a mix of automated processes as well as human collection on the ground here in the Netherlands, talking to a lot of different people. We're bringing that together, processing that data, and then analyzing it to understand the story. And then we're going to disseminate that to the stakeholders that we identify, and then get their feedback to continually work on the problem and have their feedback help guide us. And there's lots of different products and tools and companies out there that can help for threat intel investigations. There are companies that are focusing on processing data, collecting tactical data, other companies who track threat actors and can inform us about that side of things, and then, of course, companies that are focused on presenting and delivering polished intel results to stakeholders. So for this project, we had 3 high-level questions. The first one is which hosting providers here in the Netherlands are serving the most toxic content? Second, how are these bulletproof hosting providers setting up and carrying out their operations? And then three, like was said in the introduction, how can that be possible in the Netherlands, in Europe, with the existing legal infrastructure that's in place here? So we set out to answer those three questions. And our goal was to provide information to the widest set of stakeholders possible. So we were interested in understanding technically how do we detect malware, how do we detect toxic content coming from these hosting providers, so that we can alert teams in the hosting community, also ISPs, and inform threat intel teams. But we'd also like to be able to help law enforcement with their investigations, so information that we could give them from an operational perspective. And as well, it would be nice if we can inform policymakers and decision makers at a government level about some things that we're seeing, with some recommendations on what could be done at that level.
So after we define our requirements, like Sarah showed, now we want to start collecting this data. In fact, in the collection phase, for the sake of this research, we have an internal intelligence production cycle within my team. And the outcome at the end is basically have some high-fidelity IOCs that are related to the current threats. So for that, internally we define our requirements as detect the domains and IPs that are delivering the current attacks, and also provide context around those. So once you define that requirement in our lab, then we start by collecting the data. So if you already know about OpenDNS, we operate like a worldwide sensor network of recursive resolvers. So we see 150 billion DNS lookups a day, 90 million clients use us every day. We see around 100 million hosting IPs. So that's like a massive amount of raw data that can be leveraged to identify anything happening on the threat landscape. In addition, we use all kinds of other data sources. Some of them are open source, some of them are proprietary, like BGP routing tables, SSL scans, Whois, etc. This is basically what the industry itself is using. But then the way you leverage all of this is by having a processing phase, because the raw data is not useful if you cannot ask questions quick and get the answers quickly. As any threat hunter does, whether you do like vulnerability or exploits, you want to test your hypothesis. So if you have some summarized, indexed, and cleaned up data in a searchable form, then you can ask these questions and get your answers, and then verify your intuitions and hypothesis. So with that processing platform we have, it's mainly Hadoop and Elasticsearch. Now we can start the analysis, which is supposed to provide us the high-fidelity IOCs. Now, analysis is a combination of human expertise and automated methods using machine learning and graph theory and all of that good stuff. I want to emphasize that humans are very important. It's a utopia to say that machine learning will solve this problem. It does not, but it will help us kind of jump ahead of certain tedious tasks and get us to a point where we can then inject the knowledge of the expert and then again use some automated methods to move forward. At the end, you have the disseminated IOCs of high fidelity, and then we expect feedback to check if we are missing things. Those are like the false negatives, or mislabeling things, which are the false positives.
Okay, so that's like an intel cycle within the collection step of the broader intel cycle. But once we receive these high-fidelity IOCs, those are the domains that are suspected to be suspicious hosting providers. So then we can look deeper into those domains, the companies behind them, the content that we see served out from these domains, and we wanted to add additional features associated with the companies and associated with the traffic in order to get a bigger picture of these companies. So we looked at a number of features associated with these suspicious hosting providers, and a few of them were very interesting because they showed trends that are common across each one. So the business registration told us a lot, looking at the ASN setup from a network perspective, the payment methods that were offered by the companies, and the look and feel or the communications and terms of service that are put out by the companies and the way they interact with customers. These features, along with other ones, but these were the most interesting to look into further.
So let's start with the ASN view, which is kind of the network feature set. Most of us who deal with network engineering know about autonomous system numbers. Any network who wants to have a presence on the public internet has to acquire this number, and then he will get some IP space, and then his routers will advertise that IP space associated with his ASN, and then other routers he's peering with, or other networks or ASNs he's peering with, will receive that, and then the entire routing table of the internet will get propagated, and that's how people communicate. So, in fact, when you take like the routing table of the full internet, it's public. In fact, you can get it from route views, or if you are like a big company who has peering relationships, you can use your own data. Let's say if you're like a big provider or like some big CDN, you can have that in-house. But then the point is, once you have this raw data, the BGP routing table, you can build it, you can represent it as a graph where you can represent the peering relationships as edges between nodes who are the ASNs, and the edges will be like the upstream or downstream relationships. And this becomes very powerful because over the years we saw that some patterns are very explicitly associated with some rogue behavior. Now, if we go into the analysis after we try to exploit those features that Sarah mentioned, we can start looking into each one of these. So for the ASN view, we identify this concept that we call like the leaf or stub ASN. In fact, stub ASN is a known model in the networking community, but then we saw that it's not necessarily bad, we have to say that, but then it has been very frequently associated with some rogue and suspicious hosting companies. And the idea is that if you have only some upstream providers, no one is below you to rely on you to advertise their space, you're almost like a very flexible nomadic setup. Think about it this way. You set up an ASN, you start advertising your prefixes, you have some small IP space, you do your criminal operations, and then if you get heat from law enforcement or security researchers, then you can just sever your upstream and move somewhere else. So it's very flexible. It allows us like very, I would say, a setup that you can change at will anytime you want. And here you can also see that sometimes you have a chain of leaves, like the one we see to the right there.
Okay, so that's what we learned from looking at the ASN setup. When we looked at the business registration, what we see is pretty often the suspicious hosting providers are set up offshore. So these are the countries that we're familiar with from the Panama Papers, so like British Virgin Islands, Belize, Seychelles. And the companies are registered here. Maybe they're saving on their taxes because they don't report their profits, but more likely they're taking advantage of the anonymity. So it's incredibly easy to set up an offshore company in one of these countries. In the Seychelles, you can incorporate a company in one day for $1 from here remotely. So you make contact with a law firm there, and the paperwork is filed in that jurisdiction with the name for your nominee founder for your company as one of the employees at the law firm. So the true owners of the business are not filed publicly, and then the business is incorporated there, even though the servers may be set up here. We also saw that it's very common that you see a lot of different anonymous payment methods offered by the suspicious hosting providers we were looking into, so like Bitcoin and Perfect Money, lots of different options. Neither one of these features is a confirmation that there's anything criminal going on, but if you are going to be catering to criminals, then you would need to provide this kind of anonymity to them. So we took note of that. And then when we looked into the terms of service and the policies with the hosting providers, we saw that some of the hosting providers have very strict terms of service, what's allowed, what's not allowed, and other ones it's much more vague, and they seem very vigorous in serving their customers and looking after their customers as their number one priority. So here we had a conversation with a hosting provider based out of Panama, asking about hosting pirated content and violating DMCA. And essentially the answer was, we can handle a complaint, we will keep your service alive. So this is a bit of evidence or a bit telling that the hosting provider is willing to take on any customers, any content. That's not really very important for them. So we started with these high-fidelity domains. We enriched the data, adding a bit more about these businesses for context, and the findings that we came up with are a very large set. This is just a very small subset, but it's a subset of the hosting providers that we see serving toxic content in the Netherlands. The indents here, the tabbed listings, entries, are hosting providers where the ASN sits under downstream from the one above. So Ecotel, which is now Novogara, is underneath 3W Infra. Wholesaler is downstream of Enforce, and a lot of toxic hosting providers listed under Severius. And so Severius, Enforce, and 3W Infra, these are all not just hosting providers, but they're co-location centers that also offer infrastructure services to second-tier hosting providers.
Yep. So looking at that list actually now, we want to dive deeper into a ring, I would call it. So in this case, we leverage the graph representation, which is quite informative, in fact. You don't want to stick with just like flat lists of domains and IPs and have some stats. You want to explore like the time and kind of a graph representation. So in this case, we took the first step, which is Severius, the well-known co-location company in the Netherlands. They happen to have a lot of kind of rogue, suspicious downstreams, like Sarah said. We go down to step 2, which is Altus Host. This is a Dutch-based hosting company engaged in a lot of dump shops. And then if we go down to step 3, that's a downstream of Altus Host. It's called hostsplay.com. It's registered in the Arab Emirates, which is another offshore country that Sarah mentioned, but then they also have a presence in Armenia, and they've been doing a lot of pornography, torrents, and pirated movies. Now, if I go up again to Altus and go down to 4, QHoster is a Bulgarian-based company, well known, in fact, because they've been doing a lot of toxic content, as you see below, but then it's also registered in Belize, the offshore country. If I go up again and go to 5, that's another Dutch-based ASN, Felicity NL, and they are registered in Panama in terms of business, and they have been doing a lot of porn and pirated movies so far. And then finally, if we go up again to Port Lane, which is a Swedish ASN, and then go down to step 6, that's another ASN that has, in fact, a footprint in many countries, and their operations, or like the owners, are from Latvia, but then the business is registered in Belize, the offshore country in the Caribbean, and then they have been doing a lot of hosting for dump shops and criminal content. So you can see here the takeaway is that a flat view is not enough. You have to kind of observe things from I would say, a node and edge representation, and also navigate these relationships and observe them over time. That's how you see things evolving, because all of these entities are kind of a moving target, or like they're a living organism where they try to kind of obfuscate and hide the way they're conducting their operations. Now, if we want to leverage some other features that Sarah mentioned, like the offshore, but also the exact or explicit addresses. The 3 ones you see there, like Belize, Anguilla, and Seychelles, they showed up in the Offshore Leaks Panama Papers. And then now if we overlay on them like the network representation, starting from the top left, you see King servers. It's been known for providing space for both crimeware and some targeted attacks. And one of their upstreams is called Hosty Server, and both of them happen to use this Anguilla address that is actually a company formation service, as we mentioned earlier. And then now if we go to the bottom example, dataclub.biz, there's another interesting pattern we saw where if you're a hosting company, you'll try to register a lot of ASNs and also rotate or flux your IP space that is active for your customers over time. So in this case, not all of those ASNs, the 5 ones you see there, they are not all active at the same time, but they will kind of rotate through them and kind of offer a dynamic infrastructure for their customers. And they have been doing a lot of dump shops in the past few months or years. And finally, if you go to Ecotel, the well-known ones, there's nothing new here, but in Ecotel, interestingly, they are sharing an address from Seychelles with another Russian hoster who has been doing a lot of movie piracy. And also, they have been engaged in some other deeper criminal operations that we don't mention here, but then they are clearly using like some of the features that show up in the open data sets. So the takeaway from this slide is that you need to overlay the different dimensions or features we mentioned. You take the offshore registration addresses, you take the ASN relationships, you take the content, you look at how things are evolving over time, and that's how you get like this bigger picture that is just beyond single domains and IPs.
Okay, so we've done a lot of analysis, we have a lot of findings, and then in order to disseminate the findings to the stakeholders, the point is to give the relevant information to each group that needs it, and also in the right format. So sometimes you're giving text-based reports, sometimes these graph analyses, other times it's IOC feeds that go straight into security tools. And so in our case, we met with different stakeholder groups and we explained these results, but the one message that's sort of important to take away across all the groups is this recipe that we've put together for how the hosting providers are getting set up so easily and how they're able to carry out the operations. So this is our...
So the recipe, in fact... Sorry, yeah. No, go ahead. So the recipe, in fact, is the product or synthesis of a few years of investigation. And in fact, working with Sarah, we realized the barrier of entry is quite low. So we had the number of 5K a few months ago, but then we did some more work, and now it's like 2K. We believe it could be even cheaper. And the idea is that you will register your business in those countries we mentioned, like the Belizes, the Seychelles, the Panamas, etc. And then you'll have to acquire your own ASN, and then you have to acquire your IP space, start advertising it. You'll have peer relationships, you'll get traffic, you send traffic. Now you have to have a website, or you just stick with advertising in closed forums. Now, if your customers start knowing about you, they will come and use your space. They will either host bad stuff on your network, or they will use your servers to send malicious traffic, like we said earlier, like the DDoS, the spam, the brute forcing. Now, if you start generating revenue, obviously you'll have to increase your, I would say, activity, and then, in that case, unfortunately for you as a criminal, you will become under the radar of law enforcement and security researchers, and you become like you start receiving like abuse complaints. So if you're like a pure criminal and you have like some experience in that space, you will try to handle abuse and shield your customers as much as you can. But then if you can, then you'll have to shut down your operation and go somewhere else. And what we observed is that the 8 steps are always repeating from one hotspot on the internet to the other. So it doesn't matter what the country is, it doesn't matter what the rear where these actions are happening. It's a very interesting recipe that is repeatable, and it's very successful, we have to say.
Okay, so the message that we brought for law enforcement is that the criminals clearly are taking advantage of this cross-jurisdictional business model. They're setting up the business in an offshore location. Their operators, very often we see, are located in Eastern Europe, Russia, Ukraine. When you look at the drop-down language menus on these sites, you tend to get Dutch and Russian, sometimes English, but very often Dutch and Russian appear. The servers and the infrastructure, though, is based and operated out of the Netherlands. And this is very handy to complicate law enforcement investigations because there aren't very well-defined information sharing agreements between these different jurisdictions. And in the case of the offshore jurisdictions, you also don't have very sophisticated cybercrime units. So for law enforcement partnerships, that's also difficult. Because normally if you want to take down toxic content and you're in the security community up on the left and you see something, you can send an abuse complaint directly to the hosting provider. If they don't take any action, you could contact some bigger authorities like the NCSC here or the high-tech crime unit in the Netherlands. You could have them send a notice and takedown request back up to the hosting provider. And if that doesn't work, then there's a mechanism to go to the public prosecutor and request a warrant to have content taken down. But if the business you're focusing on is not based here and is based offshore, then actually the public prosecutor has to engage with the public prosecutor in the offshore jurisdiction for takedown. So that takes a very long time and is very helpful for criminal actors in order to move content around or prepare for that request. So the recommendation for law enforcement then is to keep working with law enforcement teams cross-jurisdictionally for smooth joint investigations that work quickly, and also just to keep an eye on these hosting providers because they're really facilitators of crime. So even if there's a customer that's the criminal and they're putting toxic content on the hosting provider's infrastructure, the hosting provider becomes somewhat of a facilitator of that crime.
So for the security community at large, we have some other recommendations. They're more on the tactical, but also on the operational. So I guess the message from this presentation is we really have to move away from just reactive tracking of IOCs. They are important. They will help you mitigate the current threats of the day or the next day. But then if you want to have this, I would say, power against the enemy, you have to understand how he operates behind the scenes. So we highly encourage people to look into TTPs, MOs, the business models behind these infrastructures. And the best way to do it is by sharing intel. So intel is not necessarily just like IOC feeds. They could be those graph representations, they could be business models, they could be evidence of intent around certain companies that got just registered. And you have to do it across the security community, the law enforcement. And I would say one outcome of this is that you could start some monitoring operations so you can take some early action before the attacks happen. I would say that's like one of the best outcomes we can hope for.
Okay, so on the policy side, some other things that we discovered. There's a European EU directive, which is interpreted in all of the countries. In the Netherlands, it translates to the criminal exclusion ground, and it means that hosting providers are completely not responsive or responsible for toxic content hosted on their infrastructure. So they're not responsible at all, no matter how many offenses, how many times they're asked to take content down, almost also no matter how slow they are in taking the content down. It can go on forever. They're not responsible. So it's like a get-out-of-jail-free card for the hosting providers, and makes it incredibly difficult then if you want to think about taking a hoster down, not just taking a specific piece of bad content down, which is already difficult, but taking a hosting provider down because you suspect that they're catering to criminals is very difficult, because the hosting provider can always say, you know, it's like I own a hotel. If a crime happens in one of the rooms, that's not my fault, and I had no idea what my customer intended to do. So rather than recommending full regulation of hosting providers, which might dissuade legitimate hosting providers from setting up here, we would recommend maybe a consumer agency like the Consumentenbond could keep a ranking of hosters, the sort of the top 10 cleanest hosters, so legitimate businesses could take advantage of that list, and then for a bit of naming and shaming, the top 10 current toxic hosters, just to bring a bit more attention to ones that really aren't doing anything in the way of abuse prevention.
So for the hosting community out there, what we recommend as well, and this is also on the operational and maybe beyond that a little bit, when you have data centers, we would love to see them do some more scrutiny for co-location and peering relationships. Some of them are already doing that, but then we have to have that as a systematic code of conduct, because oftentimes you see some co-location relationships that are completely rogue or like criminal. And then the second bullet is basically saying, can we have a self-regulated ecosystem where we have a certain code of conduct that all of the hosting companies can abide by? For instance, you can have an acceptable policy or use policy where you will, I would say, regularly check the content of your customers and see if they're violating that. The second one would be, we advise for like a reasonable collection of personal details on the customers, not to infringe on privacy, but to make sure we're not catering to some criminals who are engaging in some long-lasting criminal operations. I feel like there's a trade-off between privacy and I would say security and safety here for the community at large. And then hosting companies as a business model, they have to allocate some resources and some, I would say, motivation and thought into helping investigations, not just like be reactive when they get, you know, cops come to their door, they will just like freak out and give them the servers. They have to kind of have this, I would say, volunteering action where they are trying to clean up what's happening on the online community. And finally, registries, for example, the RIPE, the errands of the world, when they get ASN requests, you could also try to scrutinize who is asking you to get an AS number. Is it like a company who is using some company formation service, or it's registered in offshore jurisdictions? Have they been doing like some rogue actions in terms of tax evasion, money laundering, all of that kind of red flags, I would say, that are worth checking out before you allow them to use your space, or like ASN space.
Okay, so to summarize, we've done a lot of threat intel research, and we've leveraged the threat intel process and cycle to investigate the bulletproof hosting space in the Netherlands. We've collected information, enriched the data, performed the analysis, disseminated it out to 4 different stakeholder groups, and we're continuing to work on this problem today and look forward to making more progress in the future.
So these are some of our references. So we spoke about the topic over the months and years. The work has been in progress, so we incrementally improved it over time. But you're welcome to go check out the previous presentations. And the related work that I do with my team is more on the automated threat detection and threat intelligence. So we have had a lot of kind of shared knowledge with the community through Black Hat and DEF CON and Virus Bulletin. So I highly invite you to go check out these talks, because we talk about how do we use data to catch threats at large scale. I feel like that's important for us as threat researchers and analysts. So that's all. Thank you again for being here before lunch, and we'll be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you, Sarah and Gia. So is there anybody who has got a question that he wants to raise? There's a couple of them. Let's do 2, and since it's like we're going to go to lunch, you can maybe walk in front and do the other questions there.
Should be short. What is a dump shop?
Dump shop is just a term in the underground, meaning like a marketplace selling stolen credit cards.
Yeah, so you've been talking about shaming. I mean, if we make a list with the cleanest and the worst providers, I mean, this would be an invitation for the criminals to go on that list and take one from the bottom of the list. I mean, It's kind of an advertising and not shaming.
Well, it's shaming. It's telling legitimate businesses not to rent space with these providers so that they can avoid problems in the future. It can help provide recommendations for law enforcement on where they could look to begin investigations. It can highlight the problem of facilitators of crime, which is a huge problem in cyberspace, which is very different than in the physical world. Currently, there's no responsibility on facilitators of cybercrime. In the physical world, there absolutely would be. You have electricians who up the power in houses for pot growers. If you do that enough times, you get pulled into the police station as well. But currently, it's so easy for hosting providers to stay under the radar. I think it can be nice to bring some attention to their part in the criminal ecosystem.
So to answer your question, the analogy we can use as well is, there are some international organizations who will release, let's say, the list that you showed around, like the tax havens, like the countries with the highest rank in terms of facilitating money laundering. Exactly. And then we have also lists around what are the countries with the highest risk of being, shot or killed, like the criminality level, or like if it has, a lot of unrest or terrorist threat or risk. So that type of information, it's high level, but it's very useful for decision makers to become aware of the problem. We believe the awareness is the one thing missing in all of this, because as technical people, we understand, like sometimes you infringe on privacy, sometimes you're helping the bad guy. But then if we always have this kind of, hey, it's not my issue, then we are not helping the bigger picture. Because at the end of the day, it's the lawyers and the politicians who will make the bigger decisions to affect everything downstream. That's kind of the reality of things. So we kind of have to maybe educate them so they understand what's at stake in this case. Not just like wait until like a big cataclysm happens kind of react to the problem, if that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, time for the last question over there.
Mentioned that you want to encourage hosters to work together with law enforcement, not just reactively but proactively. I can only speak for the country where I'm from, and that's Austria. Law enforcement for a long time did everything to discourage hosters to work with them. Whenever we were served with court documents or requests for support, most of the time they were like wrong on a factual level. We would have done something illegal by helping them out because the documents, the paperwork wasn't in order. And when you're understaffed and overworked, that doesn't exactly make you want to help them even more. What's your experience in other parts, specifically in the Netherlands, with cooperating with law enforcement?
So, well, we're not working so closely with law enforcement that we're engaging with the hosters from that point of view and observing the hosters' reaction to law enforcement. But there's a lot of support for tech in the Netherlands. There's a lot of support for entrepreneurship in the Netherlands. So we saw a report that came out of TU Delft a couple of years ago, ranking badness of hosters. And when we talked to those researchers about their findings and their experience when they discussed the problems they saw with the hosters, they felt that 9 out of 10 of the hosting companies that showed a lot of badness were being abused. Probably not criminal, but probably just not aware of how their infrastructure was being taken advantage of. So there was not a lot of suspicion. There was a feeling of wanting to work together to provide data to the hosting companies and give them a chance to clean up their infrastructure without accusing them of being behind criminal operations.
I will say it varies from country to country. It's like an obvious answer, but I'm based in the US, and law enforcement there, depending on the state where you are, they will be more helpful or less, depending on maybe on the expertise, the amount of agents or staff they have. In the Netherlands, law enforcement are very, I would say, eager to solve this problem. But yeah, I don't know. I don't have like a clear answer to your question. It really, I guess, we should not dwell on the discouraging experiences. We should just try to find opportunities to move the needle and make this happen. I mean, I think
the idea of a code of conduct across hosters to show a goodwill attempt to have to avoid fraudulent signups and avoid criminal signups could be a good idea. There was an article I saw from Spam House that was written in 2012, but it laid out a lot of actions that hosters could take to prevent that kind of thing. So that could form, a template to start such a code of conduct. And I think that it can go far to separate out the hosting providers that want to be clean and want to serve legitimate customers from those who are very much not interested in making a change in that department.
Well, as thought, there's also peer pressure. So if you have people who are willing to do the right thing, whether it's law enforcement or hosters, they will feel kind of compelled to, like, let's say, Austria, they work with Europol. They're part of, NATO. And they work hand in hand with some other countries. And if other countries are willing to solve the problem, or at least try, then you'll feel like, hey, you're not doing the right thing, and you're not doing your job by being unhelpful to the hosting company. So peer pressure works too. If you do the right thing, people will feel like, hey, they have to do something too. Otherwise, they will be pointed at as lazy or not doing their job. So that's another thought I would express too.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Gia, I would say it's time for